Hi there, it's Matt here, and welcome back to the podcast, and welcome back to both a usual and unusual AMA episode, an Ask Me Anything episode. The usual part of that is I'm joined by my fantastic colleague in arms, the wonderful, the exceptional, the truly brilliant, the extraordinary, Dr. Eti Ben Simon. Eti, welcome.
Hello, Matt.
And the unusual part of this is that we've had, or at least I've had, a number of people asking me, why don't we do what Andrew Huberman does and Peter Thiel does, which is have these video recorded and so that they can go on YouTube because people like to watch it. So we're going to give it a try. What is different to the way that they do it is that this is what we call lowbrow, low-cost, janky video. I do not have, and we do not have, unfortunately, the super polished multi-camera setup. So we're going to crawl before we can walk. And then if we can walk, we may run ultimately. But this is our attempt at a first pass, initial first in line video of the Matt Walker podcast. So with all of that said, and with you fully braced for impact in terms of what the lens will do to your psyche, Eti, should we start off with the first question?
Let's start with the first question. This is about the microbiome. It's a fantastic topic. Someone's asking, how do specific bacterial strains in the gut influence sleep architecture, and can probiotic interventions actually improve sleep quality?
Oh, so it's an interesting topic because I remember maybe it was 8 years ago. I think it was Josie Broussard with Ken Wright at the University of Boulder, Colorado. They did some of the first work in this. And this is when people were only just starting to hear about the gut microbiome. And the field has progressed significantly since. Are we there with some degree of consensus as we are with things like learning and memory or Alzheimer's or sleep and emotion regulation, which is your topic? No, we're not there yet, but there's some really interesting findings. To take a step back for folks who don't know, the gut has a direct communication pathway with your brain, and your brain has a reciprocal pathway down to your gut. So the gut-brain axis, as we call it, you can think of it like a two-way radio station where the gut sends updates and then the brain sends back instructions, and both of them try to adjust on the basis of the last message, essentially. I mean, for my gut microbiome, I should say, I think it's probably more like two old friends in a British pub where the gut starts the conversation and the brain pretends to be in charge, and then both of them act shocked when things go horribly sideways. But coming back to the gut-brain axis, when that dialogue breaks down, your gut health and your sleep quality suffer. And I think that is certainly an inconvenient truth that you conclude from the data. What we know is that there was a great study published in 2022 in Nature Scientific Reports. And what they found is both disheartening and encouraging. The disheartening fact was that when they deprived individuals for 2 nights straight, there was an imbalance in the gut microbiota and the diversity of it. And specifically, it shifted where there was a decrease in what we call lactobacillus strains, which are believed to be the good microbiota components, and an increase in streptococcus, which some believe are the less good strains. Now, again, I think it's a little bit unclear in the field as to what is good and bad in terms of a balance. All we know is that a lack of sleep shifts the gut microbiome and the diversity of it to a profile that we often see in people who have disorders such as depression, irritable bowel syndrome. And that's the way that we try to discern what is a good balance versus bad balance shift caused by a lack of sleep. So that was the bad news after 2 nights of a lack of sleep. I did say that there was good news involved. What they did find is that after just 1 night of sleep disruption, they couldn't find any changes in the gut microbiome. So there may be some degree of resistance or resilience that the elastic band of a lack of sleep can stretch at least 1 night before the microbiome starts to get disrupted, and 2 nights will ultimately stretch it to the point where it snaps and you start to see changes. The inverse of that question, though, is interesting. Not does a lack of sleep change your microbiome, but can the microbiome, and I think it was in part the question that was asked, can probiotics actually improve sleep? And based on a 2023 study, there was actually a meta-analysis in the journal called Clinical Nutrition. And what they found was that lactobacillus, a strain that they labeled CP2305, if you really want to know, the
It's
on
very space
it's very, isn't it? Yeah, it sounds like, it took
like a planet.
CP2305 together with R2D2. So those strains, they seem to actually improve the quality of sleep. Now, I don't think it was necessarily the most rigorous of studies. It wasn't a randomized, placebo controlled crossover trial, an RCT, which is the classic clinical standard. But what I think was more impressive was a 2023 study that came later, and they were doing what we call a fecal microbiome transplant. And I don't think you need me to paint the picture as to exactly what that involved. But it was a really interesting study where they took fecal matter from people who were healthy, good sleepers, and they transplanted it or transferred it into individuals who had chronic insomnia. And what that ended up doing was improving the sleep efficiency of the people who had insomnia. So, in other words, they spent more time asleep in bed, less time awake. And it also allowed them to fall asleep faster as a consequence. So, I think overall, right now, I would say that there is clear evidence that a lack of sleep will disrupt your microbiome. And I think the evidence, and I've only touched upon some of it here, there's even more evidence, by the way, where if you not only sleep deprive an individual, but you put them under conditions of what looks like jet lag, in other words, circadian misalignment, that seems to be perhaps as, if not more dramatic, of a detrimental disruptor of your microbiome relative to a lack of sleep. But both of them will disrupt that. And then there's this sort of emerging field of microbiome and probiotic treatment of sleep disruption. So it's bidirectional. I do think that most of these studies are probably observational or short term. If you look at the data in the papers and you look at sort of like the individual dots of the participants and their responses, the inter-individual variability is really pretty big. So I think the variations from one person to the next in how they respond to these microbiome treatments is pretty large. I don't think we have a sense of what the dose response is. And almost all of these studies either look at subjectively self-reported sleep or they kind of use a wristwatch device to measure their sleep. None of them have done polysomnography to the best of my knowledge. So we don't really know what's going on with the electrical patterns of brainwave activity. So nevertheless, I think it's a really exciting area of science in the sleep field, that your tummy could mend your sleep, but your sleep can also disrupt your tummy. I will guarantee that most people listening to this, if they have done long haul flight travel and they are jet lagged, I will guarantee you that almost everyone probably has had that sense that their tummy feels upset when they are traveling, that there's something kind of more dramatic in terms of their tummy disruption level when they are traveling through different time zones. And I certainly have experienced that too. So I think it may be circadian rhythm as much as it is sleep disorder disruption that is causing those microbiome changes. Do you have any thoughts, Eti, on that, ideas?
Yeah, I have a few. First, I wanted to mention that we think about neurotransmitters as living specifically in the brain, and they do, but it's really interesting to know that a lot of the serotonin that's actually circulating in the body is coming from the gut. So there is a mini nervous system there that I don't think we know enough about. And that feeling of butterflies that you have in your stomach, that's actually something that has a really direct connection to your nervous system. So this highway is very, very relevant to our well-being in many ways. I'm also very excited about how sleep is connected to all of this.
Staying on the mechanism for a second, sorry to interrupt you, but what people seem to be suggesting, both in human models but increasingly in animal models, is that you're right, that things like the lactobacillus strains will both increase GABA production and serotonin production in the gut, which can help with central sleep regulation. But I think they were also showing that in rodent studies, particularly that lactobacillus strain can increase short chain fatty acids, and particularly something called butyrate. And what they were finding is that when they generated greater amounts of butyrate by way of these bacteria synthesizing and sort of chewing and eating up these short chain fatty acids, that actually increased the amount of deep non-REM sleep in rodent models. And I also know that people, I think, are starting to consider this through indirect mechanisms. such that a healthy gut microbiome can actually reduce down the levels of chronic stress, particularly chronic cortisol, as well as decreasing chronic inflammation within the body. And we certainly know that high levels of chronic cortisol, together with high levels of inflammatory markers, are both factors that we will see disrupting your sleep through indirect pathways. So I'm sorry to interrupt there, but I think you're absolutely right. We don't realize that so much of our gut produces so much of our neurotransmitter tapestry
Yeah.
and landscape. But then there's all of these other tributaries and pathways that seem to be generating sleep benefits or compromising your sleep, and your gut microbiome is also compromised.
And inflammation is really sort of a converging pathway for so many disruptions and entry into chronological diseases and morbidity. So anything that is reducing inflammation levels is really helpful across the board. And one last thing I wanted to say is that beyond, and I agree with you, we don't really know what a perfect microbiome is, but I got the sense that diversity is better. So in terms of not having just two or one population of bacteria, but really having a more diverse profile seems to be beneficial overall, right?
Yeah, I think that certainly is the case, which is also facilitated by one's diet. I think people are speaking now more about the diversity of your diet, which leads to a greater diversity in this teeming rainforest of your gut
It is a
microbiota.
rainforest, isn't it?
It's amazing. The greater the diversity of those species, the healthier and more robust you are. Ergo, this idea of eating a diverse range of foods and trying to get colors represented in your foods in diverse ways, all of which I think are geared towards not just that diverse food and diverse colored food is beneficial, but it's beneficial because it facilitates a greater diversity of microbiota.
You know, your comment on the rainforest, it reminded me of a theory that the mitochondria, that's kind of like the energy powerhouse of the cell, is actually a remnant of a bacteria that we kind of took and used to our advantage. So if you think about us having so many different bacteria in our bodies, perhaps we're kind of a half bacteria, half human. And they have so much impact on our health. We're just learning this more and more as we go.
A partner for today's episode is AG1. I've been using AG1 for quite some time now, and just for the record, I buy it myself to stay away from any of those trappings of free product. AG1 has just released the new formulation, which is AG1 Next Gen. It's still one scoop once a day, but now comes with many upgraded probiotics, plus additional vitamins and minerals. I also explored their 4 human clinical trials to prove out their efficacy, with the data showing a marked boost in healthy gut bacteria. And that's the thing. I appreciate how AG1 keeps adapting to new scientific findings. They have made many formula changes over the years, and each new iteration keeps it at the cutting edge of this space. As I've mentioned, I began my AG1 journey over 4 years ago. Any company that holds their scientific rigor to the flames of clinical trials means a lot to me. So subscribe today to try the next gen of AG1. If you use the following link, you'll also get a free bottle of AGD3K2, as well as an AG1 welcome kit and 5 of the upgraded AG1 travel packs with your first order. So make sure to check out drinkag1.com/Matt Walker. That's drinkag1.com/Matt Walker. Let's move on to the next question.
Okay, the next question is, it's a bit sad. It's about bereavement. We've been getting question about the association between sleep and bereavement. So the question is, what is the bidirectional relationship between acute grief and sleep disruptions? And are there any evidence-based approaches for managing sleep during bereavement?
Oh gosh, what a difficult question. And it's a question that everyone will face in their sleeping lives, which is the challenge of having personal bereavement close to them. We often speak about insomnia as starting with a triggering event, what we call a precipitating event, which can then lead to an insomnia syndrome that lasts long after that precipitating event takes place. And one of the most common examples that we use is bereavement. So bereavement, or let's say you lose your job, or you are going through, let's say, a difficult divorce, all of these things are of such an emotional magnitude that they almost always disrupt your sleep. And I think there was a great 2000 study in Sleep Medicine Reviews, and they looked at over 85 different studies. I think it was beyond 1,000, maybe 1,200 individuals. And what they found is that 91% of all people who had gone through bereavement suffered some form of sleep disruption. And then I think there was a 2005 study that came before that. I just remember it very well. And they showed that every single person in the study who had a deceased spouse showed marked sleep disruption and poor sleep quality. And you could ask, well, a lot of these people are obviously older adults. And so if you're just asking them, are they not sleeping well? Well, as we get older, we don't sleep well. So how do you know that that's bereavement? Because they compared that to individuals who were the same age, but who'd not gone through a spousal bereavement. And about 29% of them suffered from sleep problems. So yes, older adults suffer from sleep problems, but 100%, every single one of those spouses who'd recently had their partner depart from them was struggling with sleep. We probably don't pay enough attention to this during the bereavement process. We often go around and we ask people, how can we help? We'll take food, we'll try to be there for emotional support, and all of those are wonderful things. But I've often wondered whether a doctor or your general practitioner, your GP, when they become, or they should be made aware of the fact that you've undergone a bereavement of your partner, I think they should reach out and ask about sleep. What can we do to help you in terms of your sleep and using sleep therapies, which we can come on to. But bidirectionality, I think the person asked, is actually important. There was a study in 2023, and what they found was that changes in insomnia symptoms actually predicted changes in the prolonged nature of grief symptoms, but not vice versa. So, in other words, if you've undergone a bereavement, your degree and severity of insomnia seems to predict the persistence of your grief symptoms. However, what they found instead was that the severity of your grief symptoms did not predict the state of your ongoing insomnia. So, to me at least, it means that treating the sleep problem may actually help with the grief symptoms itself rather than vice versa. So I think it's a bit of rare good news in the story that if there's anything that can break that vicious cycle, perhaps focusing on someone's sleep may be the best thing to try to intervene to lessen their grief symptomatology, rather than trying to say, let's focus on their grief symptomatology to try to help their sleep, because they didn't see that interaction. They didn't see that lowering grief symptomatology change sleep, but they did find that improving sleep and insomnia severity lowered grief symptomatology. Does that make some sense, Eti?
Yeah, and I do think it's good news in as much as we can say in this topic, but in terms of sleep's contribution to overcoming bereavement. And I like the fact that you also mentioned divorce or other huge emotional triggers, because in many ways, even if someone has not died, but they're not part of your life anymore, and they were, this is a huge loss that needs to be processed. It's kind of intuitive to think that you are stressed over something, so you're too kind of aroused to sleep. But this is a different mechanism. This is more about loss and sadness and really reframing the model of your world without the person you have lost.
And I think what goes along with that, and I'm going to ask you to speak to this, Eti, is an immediacy of loneliness, that you are struck when you wake up every single morning by the fact that your partner, who's been there for sometimes 40, 50, 60 years, is no longer there. And it's usually just the two of you in the house, of course, at that stage, because all of the children have left. and you are struck with a profound sense of being socially isolated and alone. And maybe you could just speak to a little bit of your work as to why that feature, rather than the sense of just being stressed or being in this state of fight or flight, which you write things like a bitter divorce or a job loss will produce. It's a different symptom profile of deep sadness, but also deep social isolation and loneliness. And could you just say a little bit more about perhaps loneliness and sleep loss?
Yeah, we've been seeing in the past decade that there is a really strong bidirectional relationship between loneliness and sleep. So, if you trigger disruptions in sleep, people feel less socially interested in others, they feel lonelier. And we also see that people who suffer from insomnia typically are less socially involved, and they also tend to report greater loneliness. And the other way around, if you track people who report feeling lonely, you typically see that their sleep is disrupted. And some of the theories suggest that it has something to do, just like you said, with this sense that you're not protected, you're not safe because you are alone now in the world. And this can be especially acute because a minute ago you were not alone. So there is time to really process and how do I deal with the world on my own. And this can also lead to some stress, but it is something that we are still trying to figure out the exact mechanisms. But one of the theories is that you really have to fence for yourself now, and that's a bit scary.
Yeah. And I think coming on to that, and Etty is so modest when she says what's been discovered in the past 10 years. She has been at the forefront of this work. She's one of the, if not the leading researchers in the impact of sleep on social and pro-social interactions, including things like loneliness. I just want to give you credit there, Etty. But to come back to, I think, the person's final question, they mentioned, are there any treatments? So far, I think the best approaches that have been demonstrated are something called cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, or CBTI for short. We've done lots of topics and I've done special podcasts on that on this show. So please go back and have a look at that. People often are prescribed sleeping medications during bereavement. I think the field overall is starting to suggest that that may not be necessarily the first line treatment approach if it's involving the classic sleeping pills like Ambien, Lunesta, and Sonata. Instead, I think if you want to pair, and it's often done this, where you marry both cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia and some sleep medication just to kind of get your sea legs underneath you, because sleep, as we've mentioned, can be such a game changer when you are going through bereavement, and the severity of your grief will de-escalate as the stability of your sleep is reestablished. And therefore, combining cognitive behavioral therapy with perhaps some of the latest sleeping medications called the DORA's drugs, DORA small s. And I've done also lots of content on that too on social media. That combination seems to be particularly helpful in trying to get people over that initial major trauma and moving them on towards reconciliation. And we, of course, know that sleep, and particularly REM sleep, may form a type of overnight therapy. It may provide emotional first aid. So it's so critical to give these individuals the bedrock and the elevation lift to their sleep at a time when their sleep is going to be so profoundly challenged. So thank you for that question. So for, oh gosh, it must be at least a decade now, I have been an avid, probably more like rabid consumer of protein shakes. But the hard thing, honestly, in the supplement space, if you really understand and do your diligence, is this critical thing called trust. It is very hard to find a brand that you can truly trust. That's when I came across the company Puri and the really impressive founder. Even though I'm sure it makes them less profit versus other quick and loose companies, Puri takes quality more seriously than any company I've ever seen before. They have so many offerings, gosh, protein powders galore, but lots of other additions. But that's what I was focusing on here. Why did I choose them? Well, it's really for four specific reasons. Number one, they are free from hormones. Number two, they are free from GMOs. Number three, they are free of any pesticides. And number 4, and this is the critical confidence part, every single batch is third-party tested for over 200 harmful contaminants, things like heavy metals, etc. All you have to do if you are a neurotic nerd like me, you can even scan the QRI code on the back of the product to get the third-party independent laboratory test results. That's how much trust and confidence they place in their product. By the way, if you want a recommendation, go for the dark chocolate flavored protein powder. It's just exceptional. In fact, it's wonderfully addictive. I didn't just say that. Anyway, it delivers 21 grams of protein per serving. And for folks of my podcast right now, you can save 20%. So go over to peori.com/Matt Walker, and that is spelled PUORI.com, Matt Walker. So again, that is PUORI.com/Matt Walker, and you will get 20% off your product. Next question, Eti.
This is about creativity, a topic I like a lot. Thank you for this question. Someone's asking, how does sleep benefit creativity differently for artists versus programmers versus scientists? And what are the practical applications?
Gosh.
I sometimes think of myself as an artist.
I know sometimes I have delusions that I am, that the way that we design studies or something, or things of,
yeah, exactly.
It
feels like a masterpiece.
Yeah, it does. But then I meet a true creative artist and I think, oh gosh, no, I'm such a nerdy, data-driven scientist. But I think everyone has probably experienced this sensation where you wake up with the solution to yesterday's impossible problem. And what we've now experienced in science is the true documentation of this, that sleep actually reorganizes your brain. It's almost like a brilliant assistant who kind of, and I wish I had someone who could do this for my filing system on my computer, a brilliant assistant who kind of like sneaks into your office at night and then sorts all of the chaotic papers into these sort of perfect stacks, and then leaves sticky notes saying, have you considered this? By the way, these two things are related. Oh, by the way, this folder, you should not be linking these two things. In fact, it should be this one over here that you thought never had any relationship with this information whatsoever, except that hopefully they wouldn't require a salary by doing that at night. But anyway, the idea is that sleep provides something above and beyond simply strengthening individual memories. That's deep non-REM sleep that gathers individual freshly minted pieces of information and cements them, almost like trapping them like a fly in amber, if you've ever seen that Jurassic Park. But REM sleep does something very different. REM sleep is a form of informational alchemy, and that it starts to fuse things together that shouldn't normally go together. And as a consequence, you can wake up with this revised mind web of associations. The landmark study, at least for me, was back in 2004, and it was by the wonderful epic Jan Born and his colleague Wager, and they published a paper in a journal called Nature, which is one of the best papers in all of science. And it was a brilliant paper. And what they showed was that if they embedded a hidden rule into a task that you were learning during the day, and then you got the chance to have a night of sleep on it, when you came back the next day, you were about 2.5 times more likely to gain insight into that hidden rule nested in this huge stack of information. Whereas if you'd remained awake across the day, or even if you've remained awake across the night, so it's got nothing to do with time of day, neither of those two groups had a particularly high probability of coming back and having that aha moment. So I think that was the true first study. 2 years before that, I'd done a study when I was a young professor at Harvard where we'd woken people up out of non-REM sleep and also REM sleep. And REM sleep, as I said, is this time of creative association. And when you wake up from a stage of sleep, as you may know, unfortunately, if someone wakes you up, for the first kind of couple of minutes, you feel this grogginess. It's this kind of sleep inertia. And what we believe from animal models is that when you wake up, those first couple of minutes still have a lot of the neurotransmitter and neuroanatomy vapors of the previous stage of sleep that you just woke up from. You've got this almost 90-second window where you can have people awake, but you're almost testing the stage of sleep from which they came. Not quite, but it's very close. So we use this method. And what we found is that when you wake people up and you get them to trying to solve puzzles straight out of REM sleep within the first 90 seconds, they are about 32% better at solving anagram problems where you have to kind of reorganize jumbled letters into words relative to non-REM sleep stages. And they also seem to do it in a different way than when they're awake. When they're awake, the way that they seem to solve these anagram problems was by kind of looking at each letter and trying to logically move letters about and organize them and shuffle them and then see if a word popped out. Whereas when they were coming out of REM sleep, they just kind of stared at the word. And it was like Russell Crowe in Beautiful Mind, where all of the numbers are kind of falling down and they all snap together in a grid that makes logical sense. So we know that this happens from REM sleep, but it also happens in a stage of sleep when you're just starting to fall asleep. And there's that beautiful little drowsy transition when you go from the waking world into the sleeping world. And it's what we call the stage 1 hypnagogic state. And sometimes it's associated with these little mini dreams where you're kind of thinking, okay, tomorrow I've got to record the podcast with Eti. And then there was the elephant with the spinning propeller blade sort of with its ears, and it was flying in the corner of the room. Yeah. And it almost wakes you up. And do you remember the paper that we reviewed in Journal Club? I think it was from 2023. And what they were finding is that just 15 seconds of N1 sleep, the very first stages of sleep, increase the likelihood of you finding hidden mathematical rules. I think it almost tripled it if you were to just wake them up out of that first kind of, it's almost like you're dipping your beak into sleep. And even that 15-second window of time is where your brain starts to do some of this associative, crazy information alchemy.
Do you remember they were holding a bottle?
That's right. And so when they fell asleep, they released their muscle tone and the bottle crashed down. And that was when they woke up.
Woke
yes,
up. Yeah.
Yeah.
Edison used to use that to kind of hijack sleep.
Yeah, it's what he called the genius gap, where he would hold 2 steel ball bearings in his hand in his office. He would sit back on his chair in his office, which had an armrest, and he would put a pad of paper and a pen next to him. And then he would lean back in his chair. But what he'd done under the chair is place a metal saucepan upside down. So he didn't go too far into sleep. As his muscle tone relaxed in those first 15 or 20 seconds, he would release the steel ball bearings. They would crash on the saucepan, wake him up, and then he would write down all of the ideas that he was having by way of these little hypnagogic episodes. Brilliant.
Yeah.
Absolutely sort of.
It's brilliant. But, he wasn't a friend of sleep.
No, he was very anti-sleep.
Yeah. It's one of my dreams to write a book, kind of Einstein versus Edison, because Einstein really loved to sleep.
Yeah.
Edison wanted everyone to stay awake all the time. And I kind of wonder, now I feel like Edison won.
Well, there's a contradiction in Edison. First, if you look at some pictures, he was a habitual napper during the day. And in fact, if you visit his house, which is still open as a public sort of sanctuary, he had these little nap cots all around his house where he would take naps. So he knew the power of sleep and he used it ruthlessly as a tool. But you could also argue that Edison, who didn't necessarily invent the light bulb, but it was the Edison Light Company in New York City that essentially, for the first time in human history, electrified the night for society. And for the first time, arguably, in the human record, in the annals of Homo sapiens, we controlled the night, not the rising and setting of the sun. And it was profound, and it caused innumerable changes in our sleep patterns. So anyway, I digress. I think I've got a bone to pick with Edison.
That's what I mean. Exactly. That's what I mean, that I feel like he won. He wanted a society that's almost 24/7. And what makes him even slightly more evil in terms of like the sleep side is he would use it just for his benefit, like the 15 seconds to get an idea, but then he would like throw it aside. It's like a womanizer of sleep.
That is a very damning, very cynical view of Edison, but I'm going to go with it for all of the ills that electric light has caused and the junk light that I've described at night. And before I forget, before we come to the end of this question, there was a study way back when I was starting to I hadn't even got into the field, but I remember reading it in the 1990s, and it was Barrett found that about 50% of students would dream about an assigned problem. So if you gave
Five
them
zero.
yeah, 50, if you gave them a specific problem and then you tracked their dreams and they had to keep working on it day after day after day, you would get about 50% incorporation of that assigned problem. But what was also interesting, you could say, well, but does that mean anything? It's just kind of the red thread that bleeds through from your waking life into your dreaming life. But what they found is that 25% of those students actually divined the solution to the assigned problem from one of their dreams. So about 1 in 4 of them gained a dream dependent benefit, which is really interesting. I only know of one study. Oh gosh, I'm blanking on the name. It'll come back to me. But they compared the novel dream creation of music. And what they found was that for musicians, over 40% of them reported the creation of novel music in their dreams, compared to only about 7% of non-musicians creating novel works of music in their dreams. I don't think that's necessarily surprising, but it did remind me of the two wonderful stories. The first comes from Paul McCartney, and he was at the time down in London and he was filming, I think, Hard Day's Night, but he was on Wimpole Street in London on the top floor, and he'd had a piano installed in his bedroom. And he woke up one morning and he had this beautiful melody in his mind, that sort of, Yesterday, that sort of, if you hear a string quartet version of the Beatles song Yesterday, it's beautiful. He had that in his head, and he went straight over to the piano, started playing the music. And he thought, I wonder where that's come from. It's absolutely beautiful. And what he realized is that it wasn't anyone else's. It had come to him in a dream, and he just penned it down there. And then he wrote some stupid lyrics to go with it, green eggs and ham or something like that to begin with, but it was a beautiful melody. Also, the song Let It Be came to him in a dream. And that song, Mother Mary comes to me speaking words of wisdom, let it be. It's often deemed to have religious overtones, but it's actually not. Mother Mary is literally Mother Mary, Mary McCartney. What was happening is at the time he was going through this delusional sort of sense of this fame which just wasn't what it was meant to be. And he was getting very disheartened and I think disquieted by the fame and what came with it. And he had a dream one night and his mother came to him and said, look, don't worry, you're stressing out about this too much. Play your music, develop your songs, and just let it be. Just let it be. And he produced a song beautiful. Now, not to be outdone by my hometown crew of the Beatles from Liverpool, the Rolling Stones, I think, arguably have the best story. If you read the biography of Keith Richards, the lead guitarist, what he says is that he would always go to sleep with a guitar next to his bed and a tape recorder. And however many else other people were in the bed and whatever other substances were around the bed. But anyway, he said that he woke up one morning when they were recording an album in France, and the tape recorder had run all the way to the end. So he rewinds the videotape and he said, and I'm going to paraphrase it, but there in some ghostly image were the opening chords of Satisfaction, which arguably is one of the greatest rock and roll riffs to begin a song of all time. And then he said it was followed by 43 minutes of snoring. You got to love Keith Richards. So we know certainly that sleep, and particularly REM sleep, is a time of profound association, integration, and assimilation. And I argue that deep non-REM sleep is like knowledge, which is learning the individual pieces. REM sleep is wisdom, which is knowing what it all means when you fit it together. And that's exactly what we see for this idea of sleep and creativity. And I should mention that idea of sleeping on a problem, there's a reason no one's told you to stay awake on a problem, but sleeping on a problem, in every language I've inquired about to date, that phrase from English to Swahili exists. And what that tells me is that this creative benefit of dream sleep transcends cultural boundaries. It's common across the globe. But I think, and I'll be corrected in the comments, but I think the French translation is much closer to you sleep with a problem, whereas the British is sleep on a problem. The French is sleep with a problem. It says so much about the romantic difference between the British and the French, but I digress. moving on from genius gaps, or do you have anything to add to the information alchemy part of the equation?
I think, first of all, this deserves an episode. It's a great topic. And kind of
Okay.
like what you said, that it's all across cultures. I think in a way, creativity is like a blanket all across professions. So basically, even if you're a programmer or an artist or a musician, maybe the sensory modality would be different of your insight, but the mechanism under the hood of just taking things that seem unrelated and combining them in a different way, I think that's just across the different professions.
Mm.
So creativity
Yeah,
is
I love that
always
idea.
about thinking out of the box. And the question was about practical applications. And I think we touched a bit on really using sleep to foster or trigger that alchemy. And naps can do that. And also, of course, a good night of sleep. And for me, I really practice what I preach. If I have something that I've been working on and I feel like I'm going nowhere, I would just close it and I would try to read it as close as I can to my bedtime. And then I sleep on it
Yeah.
and I wake up, and 90% of the time I'm like, of course. How come I didn't think of that before? And it works so well that when I'm asked to review a paper, I would just read it in the evening because I know that in the morning I would just have everything I need to know. It's just so much easier than cranking away all day and kind of deliberately thinking about things.
Yeah, I've definitely done that too. I remember one paper, and it ended up being a paper in a prominent journal, and I gift Sleep the credit for it. And it wasn't the insight as to what the data meant, but it was very early on when I was trying to think about how to design a specific study, and I was trying to understand how I could do it without costing too much in terms of MRI scans. And I remember I had it designed one way where you would learn and then you would do an fMRI scan 12 hours later, then 24 hours later, then 36 hours later, because I wanted to see how memories would evolve in the transfer from short term to long term over time by kind of time lapse photographying the scans. But that would require people to come in for like 5 brain scans. It would be too much, and the cost would be extraordinary. And I remember in my dream looking at that. So they did the learning session on day one, and then they would come back and they did their MRI scan 12 hours later, 24 hours later, 36 hours later, 96 hours later. And in my dream, I remember just taking the piece of paper and turning it 180 degrees and then rotating it around. And what I realized is that no, I should do learning on time zero, then learning another set of memories at 12 hours, then another set of memories at 24 hours, then 36 hours, then 96 hours. And then on that final day, I'll scan them once, but then I will be able to measure where those memories were from 12 hours before, 24 hours before, 36 hours before, 90. So I only needed one brain scan to measure how memories had evolved because I'd flipped the script. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, that's beautiful.
And
That's
I
beautiful.
never
And it's
would have thought
also
about that, but it was sleep that came to me and solved that for me.
And it's also a great example of how sleep uses visual ways to show us something that we didn't think about before. And that happens to me so many times. What was it the other day that I was taking a baby from someone and taking care of it? And when I woke up and I was kind of thinking about the dream, I was thinking, it's someone's baby. And it was like I was taking something they really loved and cared about and
Mm.
kind of taking it into myself. And when people say this is my baby, like about a project, that was my brain's way of telling me I was taking her baby. It really is amazing, and so much for us to learn more and how sleep is doing this alchemy, not just in terms of connecting pieces of knowledge, but also making a movie out of it and really thinking about the different ways that we're using like certain phrases or certain analogies and inject them into a dream. It's
And no wonder,
amazing.
by the way, because our brains, in terms of the sensory modalities, are disproportionately biased towards vision. And if you were to try to feed the brain ideas of creativity, you probably wouldn't do it through olfaction, the smell of a good idea, or the sound of a good idea. But you would do it through vision and visual components. I spend an inordinate amount of time at a desk since I'm reading papers, and writing grants. So posture and comfort matter to me a great deal. This episode's sponsor, Uplift Desk, has been my absolute salvation in this regard. More specifically, their superb new Uplift V3 standing desk lets me raise or lower the surface without derailing my train of thought, which, to be honest, is really saying something. The science behind movement at work is really rather clear. Short standing intervals improve circulation, concentration, and even metabolic health. The desk itself is elegant, sturdy, and refreshingly practical. Plus, I can choose the finish and the layout so easily when configuring it online that I don't need a degree in interior design. If you'd like to move a bit more while you work like me, just visit upliftdesk.com/Walker and use the code Walker. You'll get 4 free accessories, free shipping and returns, and a 15-year warranty. Again, that's upliftdesk.com/Walker. Okay, next question.
Yes, this is about microsleep. So you're talking about us kind of dipping our beak into sleep. So this is the kind of phenomena of your head drops and you go into sleep. And they're asking, what are they? What are microsleeps? How dangerous are they in various contexts, like driving or operating machinery? And what are the most effective prevention strategies?
Gosh, it's such an important point. And I think a couple of weeks ago, maybe a month ago or so, it was National Drowsy Driving Awareness Week from the National Sleep Foundation. What are microsleeps? Microsleeps happen when your brain just partially goes offline for anywhere between 1 to sometimes up to 10 seconds of a duration of time. And what you'll see is that your eyelid will partially close over. Sometimes it will fully close and your eyes will close shut, but most of the time it's a partial eyelid closure, like the eyelid starts to get droopy and it looks like you're sort of getting very sleepy. And what we've also found is that from EEG studies and MRI studies, it's almost as though small little chunks of your cortex are going down into deep sleep, where you're having these deep sleep episodes, even though you're technically, quote unquote, awake, but you're not. You're having one of these microsleep episodes. And what we believe is that they account for about 20% of all car crashes in Europe and the United States. And I think at last count, the NHTSC, the National Highway Transportation and Safety Authority in the United States, they estimated that over 100,000 crashes were caused by these microsleeps, by drowsy driving. And of those 100,000, 6,000 were fatal crashes, were fatal accidents. I've always thought that the idea of microsleeps causing accidents and fatal accidents is a profound misnomer, because an accident is believed to be something that happens by chance. And we know for a statistical fact that microsleeps are markedly elevating your risk for a crash. It's a very predictable event. It's not an accident. It's a crash. And it was a predictable crash if you could have understood the amount of sleep that someone had had previously to that. We also know that shift workers, for example, face nearly 3 times the number of car crash accidents, partially due to these microsleeps. Let me come on to why those microsleeps are so dangerous, though. When you have one of these microsleeps, typically you stop responding because you've stopped perceiving the outside world. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say that intoxicated driving or drunk driving is at all acceptable. It is not acceptable in any way, shape, or form. But one of the problems with drowsy driving, and the reason that they can sometimes be more fatal than drunk driving, is that when you are driving drunk, you typically react too slowly, and then you have a crash. But with a microsleep, you don't react at all. There is no reaction. And so what people have estimated is that if you're traveling at, let's say, 60 or 70 miles an hour on a highway in an average saloon car, which is 2 tons, and you have a microsleep, at that moment, there is a 2-ton missile that's traveling at, over 90 kilometers per hour, and no one is in control. What they've also found, they estimated this when driving simulations, if you have a microsleep that lasts for just 3 seconds, that means during that 3 seconds, you will have traveled about 90 meters of uncontrolled distance. That's the length of a football field with nobody driving. Or actually, I should correct it. It's roughly twice the length of a cricket field, to put it in better terminology, more correct assessment, American football. Nevertheless, moving from a British scale, I would say, though, that these microsleeps, the problematic nature of them is the lack of response. And if you are driving at 70 miles an hour and it's a 2-lane highway with traffic coming from the opposite direction, it will only take you 1.5 seconds of a microsleep time to drift from one lane entirely into the opposite lane. And so that's why drowsy driving has been suggested as red alert, that if you have one of these microsleeps at the wheel, tragically, it may be the last microsleep that you ever have. One of the fascinating things, and now I think people like Tesla and BMW and maybe Mercedes are starting to build this into this, because these microsleeps are incredibly reliably predictable. And what you can measure is body movement position. You can measure the state of the relaxation muscles in the neck, what we call the anti-gravity muscles. You can measure with little cameras that face the driver whether the eyelids are starting to partially close, and sometimes even the steering wheel itself are starting to build in measures of heart rate and heart rate variability. And when you factor all of those things together, they can build these very clever machine learning algorithms that can predict when you are going into one of these microsleep drowsy driving events and send a beeping signal to try to wake you up. So I think there's this really interesting field of sort of biomedical technology, AI, machine learning solution to this problem. And keep in mind, by the way, there's those classic studies, Eti, that you and I know, that after being awake for 22 hours straight, your driving performance is as impaired as someone who is legally drunk, who has a blood alcohol concentration of 0.08. And I do think that at that point, you've got to ask yourself the question, is it worth me trying to get to where I need to get to and risk essentially going through a period of drunk driving? Most people would never drunk drive, but a lot of people could stay awake for 20 hours straight driving on a long haul trip. So sorry, I've got on my soapbox there, but I do think it's a really important public service message that should get out there. And what can you tell us or update us on that, Eti?
Yeah, I think you're right. It's very, very important. And what worries me is that, we share the road. So even if I'm really alert, but someone on the lane next to me has not slept, then I'm in danger too. So it's really a public service, like you said, for all of us. And in terms of policies as well, is it really worth it that we'll get our, I don't know, whatever we ordered from Amazon the next night, if it means that we're putting people in crazy schedules? This is something that we need to think about if we want the road to be safe for everyone.
And I do believe now that there are data that have led to, certainly in Massachusetts, and a law in Massachusetts, I don't know which other states have done this, where you can be prosecuted for sleep-related homicide because you were underslept at the wheel. And if you take someone's life because you were underslept, you can be prosecuted on that basis of manslaughter.
And just like
caused
alcohol.
by alcohol. Now, what's interesting is that we don't really yet have a quote unquote breathalyzer for a lack of sleep. Some people have actually argued that you can pick up signals in the saliva. I think it's components of alpha amylase, and I could be getting this wrong from my memory, but there's a couple of papers, I think one was published in Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, where they were claiming that they can get pretty high accuracy in terms of grading the severity of your sleep insufficiency on the basis of some components of saliva. So maybe we'll get there ultimately in the end, but great question. And I think really important topic.
The last rental car I had, I was driving and I think it was monitoring like how firm I hold the wheel or something. And at some point I was just holding it with one hand and I got a coffee icon
Oh,
on my
yeah.
dashboard. It's like, what's a coffee icon? I never had that before. And then, I kind of press a few buttons and it says, it looks like you need to sleep or have a coffee break.
Isn't that
And that was
incredible?
really nice. Yeah, yeah. And there are a lot of smart technologies, if you drift into a different lane, the car buzzes or there is an
Yeah.
alarm.
Even Tesla will
So
take
I
over the
think we're
steering
getting,
wheel and try to like course correct you if it feels
yeah.
as though you're drifting into the lane. Sometimes it can be a bit of a bug rather than a
So,
feature, but yeah.
yeah.
I mean,
Hopefully, technology can save us from ourselves at this point.
I suspect that one of the biggest benefits of ultimately complete automated or autonomous driving that is clearly coming if you look at the technology and will be in our lifetime is going to be that you get the chance to probably sleep on your commute to work so that people
Yeah,
will, if they've got an hour commute or a 20-minute commute, they'll probably just take a cat nap or they'll sleep for an additional half an hour. Then they'll wake up and they'll kind of do their hair and their makeup in the last hour or last half an hour and go into work and catch up on their sleep. So I think it could be a great thing. But the main thing, of course, is that it reduces those 6,000 fatalities on the US roads and the over 100,000 driving related accidents. That by itself would be motivation for autonomous driving. And I should note, by the way, a
exactly.
quick shout out to Dr. Mark Rosekind, who is a pioneer in this field. He's worked for the government, he's worked as a sleep scientist, he's worked in industry to develop automotive self driving cars. If you ever want to learn anything about drowsy driving and also just transportation disasters caused by a lack of sleep and how frightening it is, please watch him. He did a great podcast with Dr. Peter Attia. Please watch that. Okay, with that public service announcement over, we will say thank you so much for joining in. Thank you for listening. We will see if some of these videos ever make it to the public eye. And with that, I will say good night and goodbye from the camera lens from me and over to Eti.
Thank you for the great questions and thank you for listening.